Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I'm your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but they left the public divided. These are not your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts may be clear, but the truth? That's another story. Now imagine this. You are a young girl in the 1960s, left in the care of a woman who's supposed to keep you safe. But instead of finding comfort, you face relentless cruelty, not only from her, but from children in the neighborhood, friends and strangers alike who join in the torment. Who could believe it? How does something like this even happen? Well, it did. That's exactly what happened to Sylvia Likens in Indiana back in 1965. And today we're diving into this case that has sparked endless debate. Was it all the influence of a disturbed adult? Or did something deeper, something societal, lead children to commit unthinkable acts? Stick with me here. Find out more about this highly controversial case that left many people asking, how could anyone, let alone a group, go so far? Because of their nature, these cases are difficult to decide. They leave people at odds with each other. The court has made its ruling, but then it's what do you think? And today we're going to dive into this case. Endless debate around this case. So listen closely, and by the end of this episode, you will have the chance to decide for yourself. Was justice truly served? Or is there more to the story? Okay, picture this. Sylvia, a bright and hopeful 16-year-old, was left with her sister Jenny in the care of Gertrude Baniszewski, a neighbor hired by Sylvia's parents while they traveled a carnival. Little did anyone know that this arrangement would lead to one of the most tragic cases of abuse in modern history. Gertrude, a woman in her late 30s and a mother herself, took in Sylvia and Jenny for a small payment, agreeing to keep them safe. But within weeks, this temporary home turned into a place of unimaginable horror. The facts are harrowing. Sylvia endured beatings, starvation, and mental abuse at the hands of Gertrude, but it didn't stop there. What makes this case so chilling and so difficult to understand is that Gertrude did not act alone. She enlisted her own children, along with other neighborhood kids, to take part in the torment. Children who would have been Sylvia's peers and her friends, maybe even her protectors, now became participants in her suffering. This was more than just a single perpetrator. It was a community of people, led by one adult, who crossed moral boundaries, resulting in Sylvia's tragic death. How does something like this happen? And how could anyone, let alone children, be convinced to go so far? The court could answer only so much, yet the case left public opinion divided. Were the other kids simply influenced by Gertrude? Did they bear real responsibility? Today, we look back on a tragedy that reveals the darkest possibilities of influence and asks us to confront what we truly believe about responsibility. The central question surrounding this case isn't just about Gertrude's cruelty. It's about influence itself and the power one person can have over others, especially vulnerable children. How could someone convince a group, especially young people, to take part in acts so brutal? Gertrude's power over her children and the other neighborhood kids is shocking and unsettling. Her ability to convince them to harm another person, someone of their own age, leaves us confused and grappling with uncomfortable questions about human nature and susceptibility to authority and group behavior. A lot going on here, and no one's immune. Now, decades later after this case still leaves us wondering how much control individuals can truly have in a group situation, especially when under the influence of a persuasive adult. Were the children innocent victims of manipulation, or did they willingly participate in Sylvia's suffering? You think children, no way, they would never do this on their own. But then why is the public still divided here? We need to go more into this case. But could these kids have stopped what was happening? These questions don't have easy answers, but they highlight how complex human behavior can be, especially when pressured. And there's authority that blur the lines of responsibility. For some, this case speaks to the power of peer pressure, a dynamic that can turn ordinary people into perpetrators when given the right or wrong influence. And that can happen to anyone, you or me. But then there's others, okay? And for others, it serves as a reminder of the role of personal responsibility, even if you find yourself under influence. As we continue, consider, where does influence end and where does individual accountability begin? These cases bring us so often into psychology. What is that point when you lose the ability to rationalize for yourself? And can this moment be faked? That's what we always fight with. We don't understand it, and we don't know if someone can fully lie about it, and then we don't know the truth. So it's a hard thing to nail down. It is definitely not cut and dried. And before I get too far here, let me explain exactly what happened here. You know that Gertrude was taking care of the children. But Gertrude began subjecting Sylvia to physical and emotional abuse. She would accuse her of various wrongdoings. And over time, this abuse intensified. And Gertrude involved her own children and neighborhood kids in tormenting Sylvia, as I mentioned. Here's what they did, though. They would beat her, deprive her of food. They burned her with cigarettes. They carved demeaning words into her skin. She was eventually confined to the basement, where she was further isolated and mistreated, and these injuries and malnutrition ultimately led to her death. The brutality of Sylvia's ordeal shocked the community and the nation. Gertrude's influence was so strong that she managed to convince other children to participate in or ignore the abuse. When the abuse was uncovered, it raised questions about responsibility, and that's what we're discussing here. Who becomes responsible for what happened here when led by an adult? Should the children and the neighborhood kids bear accountability for their actions? Gertrude got a life sentence for all of this, but she wasn't alone in the courtroom. Several of her children and their friends stood trial as well, facing serious charges. Now, they claimed they'd been coerced, manipulated into hurting Sylvia, and that they didn't know any better. But where do we draw the line between innocence and complicity? Can young people who participate in crime due to influence and pressure be held accountable to the same degree as adults? It's a never-ending question. And then, of course, after all of this, we're left with the unsettling question, could this all happen again? Because what led a group of children and a single adult to commit such heinous acts? What caused this to begin with? And could similar circumstances create the same outcome today? Cases like Sylvia's force us to confront uncomfortable truths about peer pressure and authority, and the darkness that can emerge when morality becomes blurred. It's easy to see Gertrude as the sole villain here. Of course it is. But what about those who stood by, who knew what was happening and didn't do anything? What about those who joined in just because everyone else did? By examining this case, we are not only looking back at a terrible event, but we're also reflecting on the potential within every society for similar tragedies. How much of what happened to Sylvia was the result of one woman's cruelty, and how much was due to the power of influence? This is the question we leave with, a question that forces us to look at the nature of justice itself. Who truly bears the guilt? How can society guard against such horror in the future? The justice system made its ruling, but the public debate continues on and on. Was it enough to convict Gertrude alone? Or should those who followed her bear some responsibility? As we continue here, we're going to explore the fallout, the legal decisions, and lingering public questions surrounding a case that's as disturbing today as it was over a half a century ago. In the summer of 65, Sylvia and her sister Jenny were entrusted to the care of Gertrude. Sylvia's only 16, Jenny's 15. They're navigating life with their parents, who worked in a traveling carnivals. Their parents arranged for Gertrude to care for them temporarily in exchange for $20 a week while they traveled out of town for work. But this routine arrangement would soon descend into one of the most horrific cases of child abuse on record. At first, Sylvia and Jenny seemed to settle in, but tensions arose when payments from their parents were delayed. What began as verbal rebukes and minor punishments towards Sylvia quickly escalated. Gertrude began to focus her anger on Sylvia specifically, accusing her of lying and stealing and acting inappropriately. Soon, what might have been a tense household turned into a nightmare. The punishments escalated from scoldings to beatings, and Gertrude's anger took on a darker, more violent tone. As Gertrude's behavior grew more extreme, she involved her own children and, shockingly, other neighborhood kids. Sylvia was deprived of food. She was beaten and burned and subjected to other horrific forms of abuse. The abuse was so severe that even the neighborhood children who might have seen Sylvia as a peer participated in torturing her. Sylvia, weakened and unable to defend herself, endured unimaginable pain under the watch of someone supposed to care for her, but no one intervened. Her abuse was so systematic, escalating over time and involving numerous individuals. Gertrude encouraged her own children and other local kids to engage in acts that most people would never even imagine. This was not a simple case anyway, of bullying or teasing, if there are any. This was organized torment, meticulously crafted by an adult who held authority and power over those involved. Gertrude spread vicious rumors about Sylvia, accusing her of promiscuity, which she used to justify her actions. Neighborhood children who might have otherwise seen Sylvia as a friend were now convinced and joined in, turning her suffering into a dark form of twisted entertainment. One particularly horrifying incident involved Gertrude burning Sylvia with cigarettes, and she forced her own children to do the same thing. And she branded Sylvia with hot metal. She refused her any relief. And as Sylvia became weaker and frailer, the abuse intensified. She was confined to the basement, malnourished, unable to escape the constant torment. Sylvia's sister Jenny, though aware of the abuse, was herself under Gertrude's control, terrified that she might be the next if she tried to help her sister. So yeah, don't do that. Gertrude even forced Sylvia to write a letter claiming she had run away, likely as part of a plan to cover up the abuse should anyone start investigating. But the letter would not save her. Sylvia's health deteriorated and rapidly, and she became unable to walk. She became unable to speak without difficulty, and no one in the neighborhood stepped in to stop it. Not one adult outside of that home took action. On October 26, 1965, the enduring months of unrelenting torture ended because Sylvia died in Gertrude's home. The final moments of Sylvia's life were as tragic as the weeks leading up to them. In a last attempt to escape, she tried to get help. She crawled to the front door despite her weakened state. Gertrude's children prevented her from leaving, and she collapsed from exhaustion and pain. That same night, she succumbed to her injuries. The official cause of death was listed as a brain hemorrhage, shock, and severe malnutrition. Yet those words hardly captured the agony Sylvia had endured. Once Sylvia's death was discovered, Gertrude attempted to concoct a cover story, claiming that Sylvia had run away and was attacked by neighborhood boys. But her story quickly fell apart as authorities noticed the extent of Sylvia's injuries and then began questioning the other children. Under scrutiny, Gertrude's children and their friends revealed the horror they had witnessed, and in some cases, they participated in it. The truth of Sylvia's ordeal came to light, and Gertrude and several others were arrested for her murder. The court proceedings would soon begin, and the entire community, along with the rest of the nation, was left to grapple with the details of what happened. How could such abuse occur without intervention? How could so many people have participated or stood by without stopping it? These are the questions that would haunt the public and leave many conflicted about the nature of responsibility and justice. The trial of Gertrude and her accomplices began in 1966, bringing intense media attention to the case. The brutality of Sylvia's death shocked the nation, and details of the torture, including the involvement of Gertrude's children and neighborhood kids, gripped the public. Prosecutors argued that Gertrude was the mastermind, using her influence to manipulate those around her into committing acts they may not have otherwise even considered. The defense, however, claimed that Gertrude was struggling with her own mental health issues and that the children were easily influenced, lacking full understanding of their actions. Gertrude was ultimately found guilty, first-degree murder, sentenced to life. Several of her children and neighborhood kids were also convicted of lesser charges, though their sentences were controversial. Some saw them as manipulated children, and others believed they deserved severe punishment for their roles. Over the years, some of those convicted were released, and this fueled further public outrage, and it rekindled debates over justice and responsibility. The case left a permanent mark on Indiana's legal system, spurring discussions on the state's ability to protect vulnerable children and the role of society in preventing tragedies like this. The haunting image of Sylvia's suffering endured under the influence of one adult and the inaction of many. It served as a reminder of how peer pressure and authority can twist moral boundaries. Even decades later, the case continues to be a focal point for discussions on child abuse, group dynamics, and the legal definition of responsibility in cases involving influence and manipulation. Now, in the courtroom, the prosecution presented Gertrude as a cruel manipulator who orchestrated the unthinkable abuse of Sylvia, and they argued that she acted with intent and with malice, directing both her children and the neighborhood children to participate. Prosecutors emphasized that Gertrude's influence turned ordinary children into accomplices of torture, asserting that her power over them was undeniable. There's no question here. They painted a chilling picture of a woman who took pleasure in Sylvia's suffering, as well as her deliberate efforts to conceal the abuse with lies and other manipulative tactics. The prosecution highlighted how Gertrude exploited Sylvia's vulnerabilities and created an environment of fear and obedience. Witnesses testified to hearing Sylvia's cries, to seeing the bruises, and to knowing about her deteriorating condition. The state argued that Gertrude's actions were far from impulsive or accidental. She controlled Sylvia's access to food, isolated her from any help, and engaged in calculated acts of torture. And this torture started out as one thing, and it changed over time. It got very aggressive, and prosecutors pointed out that Gertrude even involved the neighborhood children in this abuse and the growing intensification. This is a factor that only intensified the level of harm inflicted on Sylvia, because now you have not just one person escalating their torture on you, so are a number of neighborhood children who you otherwise would think were your friends. To the prosecution, Gertrude was a clear mastermind. The evidence showed that her influence was not incidental. It was powerful enough to override natural empathy, especially in impressionable children. By framing her as a manipulative figure who instilled fear and used psychological tactics to control those around her, the prosecution sought to ensure that Gertrude faced the highest penalty possible for her crimes, arguing that her actions demonstrated a level of cruelty beyond comprehension. Now, the defense took a different approach, painting Gertrude as a deeply troubled individual who lost control of herself and the household. They argued that she wasn't inherently evil, but was overwhelmed by stress and poverty and physical ailments. According to the defense, these pressures led to irrational behavior, and while her actions were inexcusable, they were also the result of a breakdown rather than a calculated plot. The defense portrayed Gertrude as a broken woman emphasizing her struggles and health issues and financial insecurity, hoping for some degree of leniency. In their portrayal, Gertrude was not a monster. She was a woman struggling under dire circumstances. Her attorneys suggested that she acted out of frustration and delusion. She was unable to recognize the magnitude of her actions due to her mental state. They claimed that she could not fully comprehend her influence over her children or the neighborhood kids, dismissing her actions as a tragic consequence of an unbalanced mind. A tragic consequence of an unbalanced mind. Sounds good, but this is very hard to figure out in court. The defense raised a complex question. If someone's mentally unwell, to what extent are they accountable for their influence over other people? Furthermore, the defense argued that the involvement of the children complicated the issue of blame, and they claimed that Gertrude's children were also victims of their own mother's instability and the toxic environment that she created. Rather than seeing the children as accomplices, the defense asked the jury to view them as collateral damage in a household that was overcome by dysfunction and neglect. This argument was intended to dilute Gertrude's responsibility, suggesting that while her actions were harmful, they were also the actions of a very troubled person, not a scheming villain. And they extended their arguments by examining the roles of the neighborhood kids involved, focusing on the impact of group psychology and influence. The defense argued that the neighborhood children were merely following Gertrude's lead, following her as an authoritative figure who convinced them that Sylvia had deserved punishment. They suggested that children under the influence of an adult that they trust are more likely to comply, even if the instructions are harmful, especially if they see other people doing it and they trust those other people. This is how easy kids can be manipulated. They claim this was not a case of individual cruelty. This was a case and a demonstration of how group dynamics can override personal morals. Somehow, because a group is doing it, it's better than your own personal thoughts of right and wrong. This happens. So how do we consider it? Witnesses for the defense, they included reports and experts on childhood development, and they explained how young people are impressionable and they are prone to following authoritative figures because they assume that they're right and they're told to follow the orders or the guidance of adults. So are they not doing what they are told? They argued that the children, lacking proper guidance, were swept into a situation they couldn't comprehend, and they acted out of fear or peer pressure, but not malice. This line of argument sought to challenge the prosecution's assertion that Gertrude alone bore all the responsibility here, instead suggesting that her mental state had created a tragic ripple effect, and it influenced everyone along the lines. Now, on the prosecution side, the response to these arguments was very firm. Gertrude's actions were neither impulsive nor the result of poor mental health. They refuted the notion that her behavior stemmed from irrationality, insisting that her actions were coldly deliberate. They presented testimony showing that she calculated ways to control Sylvia, imposing the isolation and the deprivation and the severe punishments in a methodical manner. This, they argued, was not the behavior of someone unable to understand right from wrong. And to counter the defense's argument on group psychology, the prosecution presented instances where children who participated admitted feeling discomfort, yet they continued anyway, fearing Gertrude's authority. Prosecutors argued that while the children may have been influenced, it was ultimately Gertrude's relentless direction that pointed them beyond their moral limits. By creating an environment where cruelty became normalized, Gertrude demonstrated a deep understanding of her own power over others. The prosecution emphasized that her attempts to cover up her actions by forcing Sylvia to write that letter, this was evidence that she knew her actions were wrong and that she was seeking to avoid accountability. And to this, the prosecution argued, this manipulation was not the product of any mental instability. This was a desire, a total choice and desire to maintain control and then avoid the consequences. Ultimately, they concluded that Gertrude and her children's actions, they could only be explained as conscious, knowing acts of cruelty. The Sylvia case here ignited nationwide outrage. There's a lot going on here, and it sparked ongoing debate. It became one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. The details of Sylvia's abuse were shocking, but it was the extent of Gertrude's influence over the children that made the case so difficult to understand and to comprehend. I mean, how could an entire group of young people be swept into a spiral of cruelty? To many, this was the ultimate example of how influence and authority can drive people to actions they'd never consider on their own. The case challenged society to examine the potential for cruelty in ordinary people when under the sway of a persuasive figure. Public reaction here was mixed. Some believed the neighborhood kids were manipulated by Gertrude, and others just couldn't see it. They thought those kids should have known right from wrong. And this division led to heated discussions in the media and among the public, with some arguing for harsh punishment for all involved. Others questioned whether the children as minors could even fully grasp their actions. So many questions here. Could they be held responsible for following the lead of an adult, something kids are told to do? The trial exposed the disturbing reality that peer pressure and influence can have dangerous and sometimes tragic impacts on young people. And furthermore, the outcome of this case, particularly the sentencing of Gertrude and the children, it became a focal point of public controversy. Some argued that the children's sentences were just too lenient, given the horrific details here, while others felt the sentences should have focused on rehab instead of punishment. The conflict over appropriate justice revealed the challenges of prosecuting cases involving group dynamics and influence, highlighting the gray areas in holding individuals accountable when influenced by a powerful adult, young individuals we're talking about here. The media played a significant role in shaping public perception, of course, bringing Sylvia's story to the forefront and exposing the public to the horrific details of her abuse. In news reports, they were relentless, describing the abuse Sylvia endured and the courtroom revelations about Gertrude's role in the tragedy. Coverage emphasized the disturbing idea of children being led into violence, which both horrified and fascinated the public. Articles and television segments debated over Gertrude's influence alone. I mean, could it drive children to this much cruelty, to this extent? Or did the children bear their own responsibility? As details of the case emerged, the discussion expanded into societal issues, particularly the lack of intervention. Neighbors reported hearing disturbing sounds. Some even noticed Sylvia's physical condition deteriorating, but no one stepped forward. The media's intense focus on those details created a sense of collective guilt, leaving the public to ask, what would they have done? This sense of moral questioning reached beyond the courtroom, touching on broader issues of responsibility and community in preventing abuse. The case also sparked a reevaluation of child abuse laws and the community's role in reporting signs of danger. Journalists and social advocates argued that Sylvia's tragic death could have been prevented if someone would have spoken up sooner. The failure to intervene became a central point in the public discourse, raising questions about society's duty to protect its most vulnerable, while Gertrude and other defendants faced legal consequences. The case became a call to action, urging communities to become more vigilant and proactive in preventing abuse. As the trial continued, the defense's portrayal of Gertrude as a mentally troubled woman battling hardship clashed with the prosecution's depiction of her as a manipulative and calculated abuser. This clash led to widespread debate about the role of mental health in assessing criminal responsibility. Some in the public sympathized with the view that Gertrude's mental health and her instability and personal struggles clouded her judgment. But many argued these factors could not excuse the systemic torture of a young girl, and that Gertrude's calculated cover-up attempts proved she was aware of her actions. This case raised issues that went beyond Gertrude's guilt or innocence clearly. It highlighted the inadequacies in the legal system's approach to cases involving mental health and influence. The public's conflicted response reflected broader discomfort with these gray areas as people grappled with the implications of holding an unstable individual fully accountable for crimes committed under abnormal circumstances. This case remains a prime example of the challenges in balancing justice with compassion when the boundaries of influence and mental health and personal responsibility intersect. For decades, this case has been cited in studies on authority and group dynamics and the impact of influence on behavior, particularly among children and adolescents. Scholars, psychologists, and criminologists alike point to Sylvia's case as a key example of how authority can corrupt and how easily vulnerable individuals can be led down dark paths. The tragedy of Sylvia Likens is not just a story of one person's cruelty. This is a cautionary tale about the impact of influence on morality. It challenges society to confront uncomfortable truths and reminds us that justice is rarely simple when human behavior is involved. As we reflect on Sylvia's tragic story, we are left with difficult questions about responsibility and influence and justice. Gertrude's actions were undeniably cruel, yet her manipulation extended far beyond her own hands. The involvement of children in Sylvia's suffering reveals how authority and peer pressure can erode natural empathy and lead to unimaginable actions. So where does accountability lie? Was Gertrude solely responsible here? Did those who participated bear responsibility as well? How much weight do we give to the influence that one person can exert over a group, particularly when young minds are involved? The court has made their decisions and sentences were served, but for many the lingering question remains, was justice fully served? Did the sentence reflect the depth of the tragedy? Did they fall short in recognizing the roles of everyone involved? And what does justice mean in a case that leaves us questioning the limits of influence and moral responsibility? We are left with more than just a legal verdict. We're left with a moral question that challenges us to think deeply about the power of influence and the boundaries of justice. And so now, I turn this to you, listener. What would you decide? Imagine yourself in the courtroom listening to the arguments, seeing the faces of those involved. Do you believe justice was served in the sentencing of Gertrude and the children? Was it enough to punish one person? Did the others bear the same level of responsibility? Some level of responsibility? Or perhaps do you feel that the true responsibility may lie elsewhere, within the societal structures that allowed Sylvia's suffering to go on unnoticed until it was too late? This case is not just a story from the past. This is a reminder of the complexities surrounding justice, influence, and community responsibility. We each have a role to play in preventing tragedies like Sylvia's. But how far does that responsibility extend? And when is it fair to hold individuals accountable for actions they may have committed under the influence of another? As we close this chapter, I invite you to weigh the evidence and consider the questions, and decide for yourself if justice prevailed here, or is there more to the story? Thank you for joining me here on True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there, stay curious, and ask the difficult questions. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.